Let's check this. Yes, no, we're not.
Okay, there we go. Now we're getting audio. Let me make sure that we're showing up. This is the riveting part of this whole recording. Making sure it's working. Okay. Let's see. This is the riveting part. Hey, look at that. It's working. Awesome. Let's make this public. Okay, public now. We can share this. Let's share this onto my page. Starstuff. Chapters 3 and 4. That's what we're doing today. Reading chapter 3 and chapter 4. Live reading. Share now. Awesome. That's shared. Oh man, my hair is all crazy. Where did this come from? What is this guy? Gotta have the hair right. Right. Okay, I just want to hear what this sounds like. Make sure it's not too loud. Where did this come from? What is this guy? Gotta have the hair right. Okay, guys. I think it's almost time to get set up here. Take a drink of water. I inhaled some orange juice today while I was eating breakfast. Pro tip, don't inhale orange juice. It's not good for you. And now I've got this like scratch in the very bottom of my throat. So not in my throat, but like like you might hear me cough is what I'm saying. Because I inhaled orange juice. All right, it is 5:30. If anyone's joining, welcome. Let's pick up where we left off, shall we? We read chapter 1 and chapter 2. We left off with Petrick was with his dad, and Clark was barking. And the last line we read from chapter 2 was "Wake up." All right, let's get into chapter 3. Chapter 3. Petrick's eyes snapped open. Morning light overwhelmed all but the edges of his vision, and for a moment he couldn't tell if he was still asleep and dreaming or if this was real. Clark's insistent barking continued, and that was very real, he decided. The dream was over. "Clark," Petrick grumbled at the wee dog, groggy and rather annoyed. "It's too early." Petrick looked around the room in which he found himself. It was chaos. Clothes littered the floor, mixed among piles of junk, half-finished projects, and crumpled papers. Several drawings and diagrams were pinned to the rafters of the steeply pitched ceiling, which rose to a peak in the center of the room. Petrick's handmade wooden bed lay on one side. A wooden desk piled high with gadgets and papers sat next to it. Above the desk, letting in the morning sun, was a small round window, like one might expect to see in an attic, which is indeed what this room was. An attic atop one of the half-dozen dormitories at Childers' Home for the Parentless. It was Petrick's attic room, and he loved it. Next to his bed, barking furiously and nearly doing cartwheels from excitement, was Petrick's small, fluffy brown and white alarm clock. Standing on his hind legs, he was just able to reach the bed. His eyes were large, almost comically large for his small face, and insistent. His ears were back, and his tiny black nose pointed to the ceiling. Upon seeing that his master wasn't moving from the bed, he ratcheted up his barking another notch, which Petrick frowned at. Clark must have been getting at something. Petrick looked at the metal spike he'd driven carefully into the attic floorboards. The sunlight cast a shadow onto a series of etched marks in a semicircle around the spike. Petrick counted the marks on either side of the shadow as quickly as he could. A digital clock, like one his father had taught him to make once in a dream, certainly would have been easier to read. It had glowed with orange numbers for time and letters for dates. But to have such a device was not the Indikaran way here in the waking world. It was technology, evil and impure. 8 and 9, almost halfway in between, he counted. 8:20. Petrick's frown deepened. 8:20. Something is happening. I'm late! Petrick kicked off his twisted blankets and catapulted his lanky frame out of bed in one motion. Clark finally wagged his tail in approval, but continued barking. Crunch, oh, crunch, I'm late! Patrick ran back and forth for a couple of seconds in a blind panic before reason kicked in and he finally spotted a shirt on top of a pile of clothes. He grabbed it and started to wrangle it over his head and shoulders before halting the motion. He sniffed and, upon reconsideration, took it off. No way that one was clean. He found a shirt with a passable odor. He grabbed some pants that were too short at the ankles, but all his pants were too short at the ankles these days, and was putting on his shoes when there was a pounding on his floor. On his attic stairs door, to be more precise, the kind that unfolds down to the story below. "Petrick?" a muffled voice called out from that direction. "You'd better be dead if you're still up there." Responded a distracted Petrick as he struggled with a second shoe. "I'm coming, Susie." Clark finally stopped his barking and trotted over to the attic door, following Susie's voice. He made a small noise, pawed at the door, and looked back at Petrick. "So you are alive!" shouted Susie from below. "Good! That means I can be the one to kill you because you're late!" "I know!" Petrick yelled back down. "Stop talking to me! I'm trying to get dressed!" Petrick finished his wrestling match with the last shoe and sprang up. In a flash, he unlatched the attic door and swung it down, a ladder extending until it clanked down on the floor below. It nearly knocked into the impatient 11-year-old Susie, who stood at its base. Where Petrick was all long bones and bumbles, Susie was compact and steady. Her diminutive frame and resting scowl dared anyone stupid enough to underestimate her. Petrick scrambled down the steps, trying to flatten his thick bed-tossed hair, and prayed to Indikar that it would behave itself. Susie crossed her arms as Petrick got to her, ignoring Clark, who reached her and pawed at her furiously up on his hind legs for a hello head rub. "Forgetting something?" she asked. Petrick furrowed his brow, breathless. "What do you—" "Oh, crunch!" He spun around and ran quickly back up the stairs. Susie and Clark stood waiting as the footsteps on the ceiling above them tracked Petrick's frantic movements, shuffling from place to place. There was a loud crash and a groan, followed by more footsteps. Clark sat by Susie's feet and looked up at her, ears cocked slightly to one side quizzically. "I know," she said to him. "He'd go out naked if you didn't remind him to wear clothes." Clark responded with a panting smile. He definitely agreed. "Not true," Petrick called down. "The draft of air would tip me off." Another crash, and a small metallic ball emerged from the attic door and bounced down the descending stairs. Clark, delighted, growled at the toy-sized sphere and gave it a paw or two. "Just a second," Petrick said. Susie shuffled her feet. "Come on," she yelled. A moment later, Petrick descended, arms wrapped around a box that was bursting with some contraption. It was so full that it nearly blocked his entire vision, and as he approached the bottom step, he almost missed it. He teetered for one perilous moment before Susie raised a bracing hand, steadying her irresponsible compatriot. "Can you carry these?" Petrick asked from behind the pile. He held out a couple of the smaller parts of the mysterious whole, which was a myriad of springs and wires and nodules, and other various mechanical-looking bobs. Susie's eyes widened as she took in the whole contraption. "That's a lot bigger than it was last night," she said. "Yeah, I worked on it some more before I went to sleep." "No kidding." Susie snatched the offering and set off down the hallway. "Let's go." "What about Barry?" "He's waiting. Everyone's already there." All right, that's chapter 3. I'm going to take a little drink here. Make sure we're still going. Yeah, Yeah, looks like we are. Awesome. All right. Chapter 4. Barry was a mess. Sweat plastered his brown hair to his forehead, and he couldn't stand still. He stopped his pacing when he saw Petrick and Susie enter the backstage and rushed to grab some of the overflowing gadgetry, threatening to crash onto the floor. Barry was round and just barely taller than Susie, but he could hustle when he needed to. His trusty canvas backpack, a fixture so consistent to him it could have been considered an appendage, bobbed up and down on his ample shoulders. "Of all the days to sleep in, you do it on choosing day," he whispered, trying to keep quiet. The stage curtain was just 10 feet away. Beyond it, in the gathering hall, was a crowd of adults. "We're next!" Petrick set down his box with a clunk. That elicited a hush from perfect Bethany Hills at the other end of the backstage area, who was practicing the dance routine she always did for this special day. Susie rolled her eyes when Bethany went back to practicing. "Hasn't worked for you yet, Bethany," she said under her breath. "Not going to start today." "This thing is a lot bigger than last night," Barry said, considering the contraption. "That's what I said." "You really think this is a good idea?" "Too late now." "We'll be fine, guys," Petrick said. "As soon as they see that it works, we're out of the woods. We just have to move fast with it." "If you say so," said Barry, beginning to grab items from the box and sort them with his stubby fingers. Petrick ran his eyes over the box of wires and gadgets. "Barry, I want you on the harness set up for Clark," he said. "In fact, Susie, let's get Clark in his kennel." She finished his sentence and showed him his dog, already safely in her clutches. Petrick nodded and peered back into the box and at the stuff Barry was unloading. "Wait." He pointed to a cloth sack in Barry's hand. "That comes with me." "No," said Barry. "This is the harness you just told me to grab." Sure enough, it was. Petrick started looking through the rest of the box frantically. Then where is my controller?" he said. "It was in a sack just like that." "I've got it right here," Barry said, slipping his pack off his shoulders. He opened the top rope drawstrings just enough to dart a hand inside the canvas pouch and pull out another cloth sack. Barry cinched his pack closed again and then, with practiced ease, threw it onto his back, sliding his arms through the two straps. Barry plopped the cloth sack into Petrick's waiting hands. "Thought you might lose track of it since it's so small," Barry said. "So I grabbed it last night." "Bless you, Barry," Petrick thought. "We're good?" Susie asked. Petrick's eyes swept over the sprawling mess. It was all there. He nodded. "Good," she said. She then pointed over to the closed curtain that shrouded them from the gathering hall beyond it. "Who's up?" Petrick tiptoed over to the side of the curtain where it met the wall, and he carefully pulled it back a slit to peer out on. Sorry, let me read that again. Petrick tiptoed over to the side of the curtain where it met the wall, and he carefully pulled it back a slit to peer out onto the stage. Three boys stood in front of a crowd of adult couples who watched with varying degrees of interest as the children played them a lullaby on simple wooden flutes. It was a big crowd, bigger at least than last season's. One of the three boys hit a particularly sour note, and Petrick snorted involuntarily. The tallest of the trio stole a look in his direction and locked eyes with Petrick. It was Litz. Petrick immediately shut the curtain. Of course it was Litz. Petrick hoped he hadn't been seen. You didn't laugh at Litz or his two other comrades and get away with it. "Is Friz out there?" Susie asked. Friz was Childer's headmistress. Petrick had rejoined his friends and nodded. "Is she angry?" Barry asked. "I don't think she knows we're late," Petrick shrugged. He looked down at the contraption, half assembled on the table, and smiled. "They look asleep out there." "Who wouldn't, listening to Litz and his goons play their stupid flutes?" Susie asked. "We'll mop the floor with those grunts." Petrick gestured to the machine. "Let's wake them up." The polite clapping from the audience was their cue. Barry and Susie wheeled out the cart, now shrouded, and Petrick held a small box as they stepped out from behind the stage's curtains. The hall was old, wooden and plain, as were all the buildings in Childers. Hand-hewn hardwood beams curved to meet at the top of the ceiling, and 3 candle chandeliers were spaced along the length of the center beam at the apex. Petrick traced the ropes that hung from down to where they tied to the side walls at hand height. The grandeur of it all was designed to be a monument to Indikar, and the land, sea, and sky that provided life's necessities to its inhabitants. Chairs covered the floor, 50 or so of them, and that brought Petrick's gaze back to the crowd of expectant adults. They were waiting for a child to so wow them that they would decide to bring him or her home. They were the childless, and up on display for them were Petrick, Barry, and Susie, the parentless. Choosing Day was the most hallowed of days at Childers' Home for the Parentless. It came with each changing of spring to summer, and childless from every neighboring village and province would pour in to see if they could find a match. Many of them were homesteaders who lived out in the wilds, where life was more precious, where life was more precarious. On Indikar, family was sacred, no matter where you lived. Every parentless child who was not chosen to go home with any of the childless carried a mark of shame, not only upon themselves, but on Childers and the Indikaran people as a whole. Family was life, and family meant parents with children. How many would be chosen today? Will I be chosen today? Petrick thought. Litz and company were finishing their bows ahead of the trio as they came out onto the stage. So sweet, Petrick heard someone say. Litz smiled and bowed again to the crowd, then turned around and shot Petrick a different kind of smile. As the two passed each other, Litz stuck an elbow into Petrick's side that made him grunt and lose his grip on his small box for a split second. A small saucer-shaped device clattered onto the floor, and Petrick's heart leapt to his throat as he worried that the crowd could see. "Nature's fortune!" Litz cried out. "Let me assist you, brother!" The crowd murmured its approval of the gesture and his use of the formal Indikaran language. Petrick gritted his teeth. If you fools only knew. Litz held out a small saucer, and Petrick snatched it away before the bully could do anything further, or the crowd could catch sight of it. Litz let out a chuckle quiet enough for only Petrick to hear, and then stalked off stage. Petrick turned the saucer over in his hands. He caught sight of Barry and Susie a couple of paces away, looking worried. Petrick reassured them with a slight shake of his head. The saucer wasn't damaged. He set it on a small table in the center of the stage and looked up at the crowd. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, wide like moons, waiting for them to begin. Petrick next saw Mistress Friss sitting in the front row. Her eyes were ablaze and communicating one single, very clear message. Get on with it. Petrick cleared his throat and looked over at Susie and Barry, who were wondering what in the blazes was taking him so long. "Gratefulness for your presence," he said, addressing the crowd in the stilted language used on such formal occasions. "I am Petrick of 11 Seasons. She is Susie of 11 Seasons, and he, Barry, of 10. Today, we 3 present to you as a group, as one, as we are one with the sacred Indikar, who is the mother of us all. May Indikar bless this choosing day. May we find a match in each other, choose and be chosen to become one. As one, we wipe away our shame." He had memorized the words 1,000 times over, but they still came out stiff and halting. Petrick could hear Mistress Friss's clenched jaw from the stage. "Family is life," he said, concluding the sacred words. "Family is life," repeated the crowd. Petrick bowed, and then nodded to his 2 compatriots, who brought out Clark from a shrouded cage. The dog saw Petrick, barked, and tried to wiggle from Barry's grasp to get over to his master. The watching crowd of adults murmured in amusement, which spurred Petrick on. "Prepare to be amazed," he proclaimed. Petrick gave Barry and Susie another nod, and they unshrouded the sheet-draped machine. It was even more impressive in all its assembled glory than Petrick had even hoped. He heard the crowd murmur again. He knew that their first reaction would certainly be shock, and he was counting on that. If he could just show them what this machine could do, he knew they'd change their minds. Barry and Susie speedily placed a small harness onto Clark. It had wiring connecting it to the contraption, and Clark couldn't help but squirm in petulance. No dog enjoys being restrained when there are new people to meet and greet. Barry, remembering his role, produced a bag of Lyric morsels from his pocket. Clark immediately quieted, instantly entranced by the small round meatballs. Petrick picked up a smaller, square handheld device from his table and hauled out the saucer-shaped object. In full view now, it looked like two dinner plates pressed face to face, with a boomerang-shaped antenna on top. He turned back to the crowd. "Using this device we have created together," he motioned to Barry and Susie, who were looking tense and sweaty, "we will use static energy to fly this remote-controlled saucer here with no wires or mechanical force." There was dead silence from the crowd. "This is good. Keep going before they stop you." "My dog Clark will provide the static electricity to power the craft." Petrick nodded at Barry, who plopped a morsel into Clark's waiting mouth. He chewed it happily and didn't even notice as Susie began to rub his fur vigorously. The machine jolted to life, whirring and clanking here and there as arcs of electricity began to spread and wheels turned. After the briefest of moments, Petrick's saucer began to hum as well. Petrick tapped a button on his handheld remote, and with a wobble, his saucer hiccuped up for a brief moment into the air and then came back down again. Petrick frowned and looked at Susie and Barry. They saw the cue, and Barry gave Clark another morsel as Susie increased the intensity of her rubbing. In a flash, something entirely new occurred to Petrick. What if it doesn't work? As the terrifying thought danced through Petrick's brain, the saucer began to match the intensity of Susie's gesticulations on Clark's furry back, with a volume spike in its humming. There was another lurch up off the table, but this time it stayed floating, wobbled, and then flew straight up into the air. There was an inhale from the crowd of adults, who awoke from their shock as the saucer soared above their heads. Petrick whooped in exultation. "As you can see," he called out over the din of the surprised adults, "it is receiving electrical power without cables, allowing it to fly freely. It is perfectly safe, completely technological, and wonderfully fast." Frizz, he could see, was trembling and furious in the front row, but she hadn't told them to stop. It had happened too fast, and now it would be incredibly rude and embarrassing to everyone to intervene. With his remote, Petrick swooped the saucer down toward the crowd, and then up again in an elegant arc, producing just the collective gasp he'd wanted to. He beamed, looking out over the awestruck crowd. "It's a simple design using magnets, something my father taught me, and something I think might be very useful here at A loud clank interrupted Petrick speaking. He looked back up to the saucer to see it had been going faster and faster in his inattention. He glanced at his remote control to make sure he hadn't bumped the throttle. He hadn't. That was when he heard Clark beginning to bark. The fluffy dog was half off the table, squirming frantically in his harness, while Barry was on the floor trying to gather a spilled pile of Lyric morsels. He must have dropped them, but Lyric morsels were round, and round things like rolling in every direction they can. Clark was beside himself. His wiggling to escape was apparently producing far more electricity than Susie could ever have mustered with her rubbing, and all that extra power was flowing straight into the machine. Another louder clank yanked Petrick's eyes back to the saucer, as it was now careening around the room at an alarming speed. It dipped and dove over the assembled crowd. Somebody was going to get hurt. "Petrick!" a voice rang out. It was Mistress Frizz. She was standing now, her face a deep red, and her eyes on fire. She was done staying silent in the name of decorum. "Shut it off!" Just then, Petrick heard a new sound, a snap. The saucer had sliced into a rope that was holding one of the massive candle chandeliers. The rope frayed and broke. The chandelier fell. "I'm dead," Petrick thought. And that's the end of Chapter 4. All right. I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for watching, if you did. Tomorrow's Friday. We'll be right back here tomorrow. Same time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific seems to be working great for me. I hope it's working for you. And we'll pick up with chapter 5 and that falling chandelier. The only other thing that I wanted to share was that I have set up a YouTube and a playlist on YouTube that I'll set up so that if for some reason you come into any of these recordings that I'm doing out of order and you want an easy way to go back and find the older recordings, the first chapters, so you get the whole story, I've created a playlist on YouTube that'll play them in order. So actually, the easiest way to do that is probably just to go to iraheineken.com. Right on my homepage there, on one of my featured posts, is the article called Starstuff Live. If you just click on that, there's a link there that'll take you to the YouTube page, and you can do it that way if you want to. But thank you those who joined live today. And thank you everyone who's listening after the fact. It's so much fun to do this. I hope you're enjoying it as well. And I will see you tomorrow.